Hey everyone. This deck is pretty interesting for a couple of reasons. So specifically, Banksy being the weapon is actually kind of innocuous. At first, it doesn't seem that strong, but if you start to break down what this deck can do, this is essentially a 1-for-3 that threatens an on-hit to make a resource the next turn. That may be kind of self-explanatory, but it doesn't always seem apparent like what the play pattern is. You're like, oh, do I just like swing the weapon once in a while when it's available to me? But I think the thing with the aggro deck is it has such a consistent game plan. You do the same thing almost every single turn, and then eventually you kind of upcycle into like a power turn, and then you go back to building the engine. So I think the way I describe this deck is an engine aggro deck. It falls apart when you don't have hyperdrivers. When you go down to one card, if you just go off the game plan, but as long as you stay on the game plan, the deck is like decently consistent. I don't know how strong it actually is. It feels a little bit weak. The problem for me compared to OG Dash is that you don't have more power cards. So we're gonna spoil a little bit of the list. The only big actual payoff card here is just max velocity. If you compare that to normal Dash, if you have like an aggro Dash list, you have the same shell, except you're able to also include high octane and plasma pistol. So you have 6 power cards, and this list is basically just the same, but with half of the amount of power cards that normal Dash has, because you just can't use high octane in this deck. It just doesn't really work. So we'll go through the equipments really quickly. So adaptive plating is your flexible slot for boots. Maxx doesn't use Achilles accelerators very well. It doesn't really have any synergy in the deck that I have found yet. There's some very niche use cases for Achilles where you're like, oh, I guess I could use this here and maybe save myself having to use Foundry Heart or something like that. It's just like the actual use case for Achilles is very low in this deck. So you would just rather have adaptive plating and once in a while be able to turn a hyperdriver token into 3 block on your legs, and then it's just better value. The Cogworks base arms are okay. There's actually a very niche use case here where you can actually pay one and it buffs your next mechanologist attack, which is relevant because it actually targets Banksy. So you can have Banksy come in as a 2-for-4 one time with the Cogworks base arms. And then we'll get into Evo Facebreaker, but this is the reason why you're playing it. And then Crown of Providence, Foundry Heart. Foundry Heart feels really integral for this deck. I think previously in Dash aggro list, you could get away playing a Hardened Crossstrap. I think that like Foundry Heart is like pretty aggressively needed for this deck, unfortunately. So what is the main gameplay pattern? The main gameplay pattern is you need to boost once per turn to turn on the effect. You need to pay 2 to make the hyperdriver counter or the token. And then you need to have 1 extra resource to swing the wrench. So just for the ability plus the wrench, you need 3 resources a turn. So that means that you need a blue pitch and you need a 0 cost, at least for the first time you want to do this. What happens is that after, Max's ability means that as long as you're paying 2 every turn, you're always going to refund one of those resources back. So you're able to make an engine where you're now, instead of having to go 0 cost, pitch a blue, ability wrench, you're now able to go 1 cost, ability wrench. If you're in a really tight situation, you can use Foundry Heart, but this deck is a little bit susceptible to fatigue because it lacks some of the higher payoffs that Dash has. And even in Dash, you just gotta be, it's almost like if you're ever in a longer matchup, just using Foundry Heart is normally the wrong decision because it just banishes too many cards unless if you're really pushing damage. So in an aggro race, you can be a little bit more aggressive with your use of Foundry Heart, but you have to manage it pretty tightly. So you really do want to stay on this pretty simple curve. You're going to send a 1 cost, you trigger the hyperdriver. So you pitch a blue to do this. So then you go back up to 3 resources. This is after you set up your first hyperdriver. You have 3 resources, you max, you Banksy. If the Banksy hits, then you're going to roll over 2 resources over the next 2 turns, which is even better, and then opens up different play lines for the deck. But your main core game plan is you always end the turn with a hyperdriver and you always try to swing Banksy. So it's just 1 cost, your ability Banksy. It's very linear. It doesn't really deviate from anything. And then what happens that once in a while, you cash in like your extra resources and you like send a max velocity instead, right? So every once in a while you have a power turn where instead of going hero ability Banksy, you keep more cards and you go like max velocity end the turn. Or, you know, you keep more cards and you can pulse wave and then maybe still be able to Banksy, or sorry, still be able to max. Maybe you can't Banksy, but that's fine. You just always really want to try to end the turn with a hyperdriver. And sometimes it is correct to not swing the Banksy and just to hold the hyperdriver with 2 counters and then start to get the cycle going again. It reminds me a little bit of maybe something like Bolton, where you have these like kind of inefficient turns, but it's like on turn, off turn sort of thing. But the difference is that Maxx feels very consistent if you're not being disrupted and you're not forced to go off your game plan. So as long as you're able to keep up the tempo of attack and maybe extra attacks, right? So if you have like a 0 cost, you can go like attack, 1 cost, Maxx, Banksy, then you know you're using cards more efficiently and you're being more aggressive, things like that. Evo Facebreaker is pretty interesting. So the way this card works is that when you have, let's aim for 2 hyperdrivers. You want to aim to have 2 hyperdrivers out when you play this, which is pretty reasonable if your Banksy ever connects, or if you just end your turn with a hyperdriver without using Banksy. If your Banksy hits, then you'll have 2 counters on your hyperdriver, so the next turn when you play it, you'll be able to make a second hyperdriver. If you crank it, it doesn't matter, but the point is you have 2 hyperdrivers now on the table. Or if you have a turn where you boost, make the hyperdriver 2 counters, then the next turn you boost, it loses a counter, you make a second hyperdriver. So there's lots of turn cycles where you end up with 2 hyperdrivers. That's where Facebreaker really comes into play. So Facebreaker destroys the 2 tokens that you have, so the 2 hyperdrivers. So it prevents 4. So it essentially becomes an instant speed D-react for 4, prevents 4. And then what happens that now back on your turn, you have 3 cards now banished underneath it. So you have Cogworks base arms, and then you have the 2 token hyperdrivers underneath the arm piece, which means that now you can convert that into 6 damage. You basically turn this into a pounder that also prevents 4. So if you have 3 boost cards on your turn, you can just cash in all 6 damage immediately. This is a really good tempo swing. The big problem is it's a red non-block, and it only works if you set that up correctly. And sometimes you just don't always have 2 hyperdrivers because like your core game plan is just ending the turn with a hyperdriver. So if you ever have a moment where like you just you draw it and like you don't have the appropriate setup for it, it feels really bad. So you kind of want to be playing consistently. So when you do draw it, it normally isn't that hard to get to that point. Maybe it has to sit in an arsenal for like a turn or 2, but I think it's worth it. I'm only running 1 in the main board. I'm running a second copy in the sideboard. The main reason why is because once you play the first one, the second one is literally a dead card. It doesn't block and it pitches as a red. So it's a terrible card once you've cashed in the first one. The first one's very strong, but any redundancy is very difficult. You can win games perfectly fine if you boost it away, but if you're able to draw it, it does push you just a little bit closer towards like those good numbers that help you win games. So I like it as a 1-of. Maybe you can go 2, but I think this deck is a little bit slower than your typical aggro deck. So you can normally live long enough, especially the concentration of 3 blocks. You can normally live long enough to try and see the card. So I'm not super concerned about it, and you can still win games if you don't draw it. Everything else here is just very min-max upgrades from the new set. Overall, I'm like kind of underwhelmed by the new boost cards. They're just like mimicking different cycles but slightly worse. So like Dive Through Data and Data Link are just copies of 0 to 60 and Zipper Hit, but just have marginally different effects on them. Like Fender Bender is sometimes a red Zipper Hit, but most of the time it's not. Under Loop is just, you know, once again downscaled Zipper Hit, but with like a marginal use case on hit. But the thing is that these just add more consistency. We don't have to run 2 costs now because 2 costs don't work in your curve anyway. So those are pretty good. Some other interesting inclusions are going to be Quickfire and Recharge. Recharge is pretty good. I think it's the better one of the 2, but every once in a while, if you have cycled into 2 hyperdrivers, then Quickfire becomes a 0 for 4. These are also cards that don't boost as well, which is pretty good as well because it just helps keep your deck size a little bit higher. Sometimes that matters, sometimes it doesn't. Big Bertha is a sick card. I love Big Bertha, and it is actually pretty good. It's just an additional inclusion, mimics Crankshaft, slightly better stat line, but slightly more expensive. Anything else interesting here? It's just going to be Moonshot. So Moonshot is just in the deck. Like every once in a while, you will get to cash it in at the end of the game. This is mostly a card you're probably going to block with. And honestly, maybe it could get swapped out for a sideboard card because the sideboard currently is actually built around Moonshot, just as a powerful finisher that gets past fatigue. So that's the main deck. Very simple playline. It's a little bit tricky to get started with, but once you like really get into it, not that difficult. You're just going For the first time, your first turn, so if you go first, you should boost, and you should end your turn with a hyperdriver. You don't have to Banksy, so you can have a hyperdriver 2 counters. If you go second, you can hyperdriver and then swing Banksy if you want. And then after that, all you're doing is you're going 1 cost, Maxx, Banksy. That's all you're doing until you get to a power turn where you're gonna play like Max Velocity, and that's literally the entire deck. That's the entire deck. It's not very complicated. It's not super strong, but it's consistent and it's pretty interesting. For slower matchups, you have an extra copy of Facebreaker in case if you banish the first one. You can also crown away the second one if you end up drawing both in the same game, but into a deck that has the potential to fatigue you, you really need to make sure that you're actually drawing this card because the +6 is just too good. Blessing and Gas Up are ways for you to recycle the hyperdrivers. This lets you have more powerful turns. So if you can have a turn where you can play every card in hand, even including your blues, you can push through more damage. Moonshot endgames, where you can go Blessing to end your turn. And then on the next turn, you pop the Blessing, you get 3 hyperdrivers. You boost out like a really big turn, and then you send a Moonshot, right? And in that case, you could actually bring in Achilles, so you're able to double Moonshot, or you're able to play a Max Velocity into a Moonshot, something like that. Really expensive, but this is the tech for a slow matchup, so something maybe like Assassin, Guardian, something that can fatigue you out that's not super aggressive and gives you the ability to set up. Smash and Grab is a 3 for 7, has a marginal use case in certain decks that run items. Penetration Script is actually, I can't tell if this card is good or not. I'm not really sold on it either way. This card has the potential to be better than Art of War. The problem is you're really only boosting, even in mech, even like in a very aggressive mech deck, you're only boosting like maybe 2 to 3 times a turn. Max Velocity is hard to play. So the problem is like, if you boost 3 times, twice, that's your top end. Like that's like, you kept all your cards and you took a bunch of damage to send it, in which case Penetration Script doesn't really do anything, right? So if you play it and then you crank it, and then you play the rest of your hand, you're maybe getting 2 to 3 boosts in at max, in which case Penetration Script is just a 1 for 3. In different decks where you play Art of War that have a bunch of chain links and a bunch of small attacks that can duplicate themselves or split up into different combat chain links, so like Double Strike, Flame Call Awakening, like the reason why Fi is able to use it, it makes more sense. In a mech deck, this effect is not that good. So I think this card eventually could get cut. The only question is whether or not you want it for fatigue matchups, right? You're able to like set up like a really big power turn with it. The more interesting thing I think with this deck is that Banksy can threaten to put more counters on the Penetration Script, which allows it to stay around for longer. So if you can Banksy hit in like an Aggro race, and this stays on the table for 1 more turn, then maybe it becomes a 1 for 6, which is a better, but still not great. It's a non-block as well. So this is a card I'm not super sure should be in here or not. We just have AB, and then we also have Hyper X3. If you want a longer, grindy mid-range game, you can run the hyperdrivers and try to hit them. I'm not really sure if that's where you should be though, because you also may need to run more hyperdrivers. So it could be, if you do want to do that, you could go like Hyper X3, and then these could be yellow hyperdrivers, but that's hard to hit. So some of the sideboard makes sense, but also it could be just swapped around to Mechanoid, but this is just the initial testing. This part almost feels completely solved. I don't think this was a very difficult deck to crack. If there's something more broken to it, it's a little bit more difficult to understand. So I think surface level, this play pattern makes sense, and it's what the hero ability and the weapon kind of dictate. So the main board makes sense to me, at least. The sideboard is where things get a little bit dicey. So that's Max. Stick around for the rest of the week because we're going to be going through all of them. So I have a Dash control list on the way. That one's actually really interesting. We have Max Mechanoid and then Dash Aggro as well. And then I'll try my best to figure out what's going on with Tech Levasan. But yeah, so we're in for a busy week. And then people also asked me for a pre-release guide. I think this limited format is going to be not super easy to figure out before playing it. So I'm not sure how helpful that would be, but I could try to give like a very introductory idea of like what I think the format's going to look like. So until next time, thank you for watching.